Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Kenji Maeda. I am the Executive Director of the Greater Vancouver Professional Theatre Alliance. And we have Martha Rands here, who is the Director of Programs of the Pacific Legal Education and Outreach Society, which also runs the Artist Legal Outreach and Law for Nonprofits. So today's webinar, thank you so much for being here to go through this webinar. It's part of our Working Through This series, where we're going to be talking about a number of different issues and challenges that are specific to a response to COVID. I'd like to acknowledge that both Martha and I are on the unceded Coast Salish territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. This is where we're based, but we also do know that there are a number of people from across the province as well as across Canada who are participating in this conversation as well. So just know that we have a lot of people on here from the cultural community. So thank you very much for being here with us. We're going to kind of as mentioned in the description, we're going to really focus on the questions that have come through. But if you do have any questions around that you want Martha to answer, then please use the Q&A box in your Zoom window, because that's where I'm going to be looking at in order to answer or ask the questions of Martha. So please just focus your attention there. And then for those of you on Facebook Live, feel free to ask your questions in the comments section, and then those would be fed to me as well by Amanda, who is monitoring that. So that's kind of the process. We are going to be done this webinar by 12 o'clock Pacific. So it's about 55 minutes total. So feel free to ask your questions at any point throughout the process. And I'm going to just, anything you want to add, Martha, before I get started with some of the initial questions?
No, well, yes. Hi, everyone. This is the first of what will probably be a series of conversations that Plio is going to start hosting next Wednesday. We're going to try to do them every week on a variety of topics. We'll be both speaking to nonprofits as organizations, as well as particularly arts and culture folks. And I'm really excited to kick this off with the GVPTA. I think that now is the time for all of your art service organizations to demonstrate to everyone how important they are to our well-being. If I'm not able to answer your question, don't fret, there'll be other opportunities. And as always, you can find us at artistlegaloutreach.com for where we have our legal clinic. So.
Great. And this webinar will be recorded, so we will have access, or you will have access to it later on as well. And any questions that we can't answer today, Martha will be taking those and including those conversations or answering those questions as part of her webinar series as well, specifically focused on legal questions. Okay, so to start off, of course, one of the big questions that have been coming out is around the term force majeure inside contracts and agreements. Could you talk a little bit about what that means, what that looks like, what's the impact of that clause inside most contracts?
Right. Well, you know, the difficulty with speaking about these things in a complete vacuum, that is to say without an actual example in front of me, means that some of this is going to be the standard lawyer answer, which is, well, it will depend on what your contract says. Force majeure are those kinds of triggering events that would render the contract in effect unenforceable. And usually those provisions are followed up with examples like an act of God, war, disaster, and words of that nature. There may also be language in there around what you do in the event of a force majeure and the way in which you would have to invoke it. So, in my experience, what we see is that many contracts put in the arts, it sort of depends on the contract, don't actually include these provisions. So for those of you who don't have them in the contract, then what you're probably going to need to look at is what are the cancellation or termination provisions of the contract. For those of you who have them in contracts or leases, then you need to look to whether or not they would have an effect in this instance. Is the declaration of a global pandemic and emergency measures in your city or province, or indeed in the country, something that would trigger the application of force majeure? I suspect yes. Certainly, to date, I don't think we have case law on that, but I'm sure we will very soon. But I would be operating on the assumption that this would be an event that is outside of the control of pretty much anyone, with apologies to any conspiracy theorists out there who know who is responsible. So I think what I'd like to know is maybe there's somebody with a follow-up who has a specific example. Is it a cancellation of a performance? Is it in the standard pact contract, for example, and are engagers using it to cancel their seasons? Are there any obligations to the artists nonetheless? The answer to that probably is yes, particularly where artists can demonstrate that they set aside time. Maybe you're in the middle of rehearsals. There are consequences. They should be paying you. There are ways of mitigating the damage that the cancellation can have by ensuring in a contract ahead of time that you have you get a guarantee up front, you get a signing bonus, you get some money and or a cancellation fee, or in some other contexts, we call them kill fees. So in other words, if the rug is pulled out from under the promoter by virtue of an act of God, that they still have to pay a kill fee to the artist. Now, you generally have to be in a position of some bargaining power to be able to negotiate that into your contract. I see it extremely rarely, but those are related provisions in a contract that we would need to look to see what the best options are.
And thinking about contracts, some of the questions that have come through are around building new contracts. So because we don't know how long the physical distancing requirements are going to be in place, which means that we don't know when a gallery will open, a show will open, what's your recommendation in terms of agreeing to things for the fall? Do you think that people and artists and organizations should actually be signing things now, or should it just stay in this ether kind of verbal agreements? And how effective are verbal agreements? Like, what are the recommendations?
Yeah, let me answer the first question, or the last question first, which is, are verbal agreements binding? Well, yeah, they can be actually. And these days, many of us are not actually making verbal agreements. We're making text-based agreements. And by that, I mean text-based and or email-based. And those agreements are binding and they can be used as evidence in court. In fact, Judge Judy routinely accepts printouts of text messages to set up what the conditions are, or the agreement is between the parties on Judge Judy. Yes, I have too much time on my hands. So these are still agreements that are binding. My suggestion is now that if you don't have a cancellation provision, put one into every single contract and deal with it outright. What happens if you have to cancel? How much notice do they have to give you if they're going to cancel? Is it a month so that you can get another gig? Is it 2 weeks? What's reasonable in the circumstances? And then if they are in a position to offer a cancellation fee, that might go some distance to not completely pulling the rug out from under the individuals. I think musicians are have been put into a very difficult place because a lot of musicians have simply had the rug pulled out from under them with very little notice. And many gigging musicians, they barely have a contract. And if they have a contract, it doesn't have a provision that gives them anything in the event of a cancellation in a circumstance like a mandatory closure by a government body. So they need to start asking, if not demanding, that those provisions be incorporated in to their contracts moving forward. And I think that, I did have a question from a client that was asking, had contracts, and rather than terminate all the contracts because the festival couldn't go ahead, they've tried to encourage the artists to provide some kind of online content that they can then make available in a sort of virtual festival of sorts. And that way the contracts are still valid, they're enforceable, people are getting paid, the organizations don't feel caught out, funders are happy. It kind of keeps everybody happy if there's an ability to do that. At the same time, is there an ability to move performances from a stage onto a virtual stage, for example? I know that the Aga Khan Museum had a performance of a Qawwali group. Presumably it was a group that they had that was touring. They were from Pakistan, and they made arrangements with another company. I mean, they're a group of 10 musicians, and they live streamed it and have archived it, but they couldn't actually do it at the museum. I would encourage people to look to, are there other venues that are not going to pose the issues that we have? At the same time, for a theater like the Arts Club, I can't imagine them simply pivoting to an online platform without having the ability to monetize it. So that's going to be a struggle as we move through this.
I also want to say that if anybody's asking questions in the Q&A window, you have the option of asking it anonymously, but also know that I'm not going to say your name attaching it to a question. So you're not going to be, you're free to ask any questions that you are.
Though it would also help to know the discipline and whether I'm speaking to an artist or an organization, because it is going to make a difference in terms of the answer. And in case anybody is unclear, I should have said this at the beginning, this is legal information, not legal advice.
Thank you. There are a number of questions that are related to artists who are anybody, arts workers, and their living situation. So their rent, their landlord is raising rent right now, or they live in a artist loft, and it's already being subsidized, but it's it's falling through the cracks. What are your recommendations in terms of
Right.
those kinds of housing questions?
So first and foremost, tenants.bc.ca, track, tenants, resource and advisory services. They got money from the government to have lawyers give you advice. Yes, one-on-one legal advice. They have legal advocates, and they are set up to deal with residential tenancy matters. Call them, call them, call them, and call them again. They need to increase the services they're offering. They need to get government to give them the money to do that, because this is by far the biggest issue that I'm seeing across the social media channels that I'm following. So go to them first. I don't practice in this area nearly enough to be advising anyone on this. That being said, document, document, document. If if a landlord is upping the rent, how did they do it? Is it a text message? Is it by email? You need proof. If you're in an illegal suite, you're in a tough spot. But I don't know what to suggest if you're in that situation, but track will know how to address this. They have sample letters that should be written, you can write. You have to, I know that some people are really reticent about having some of these tough conversations with landlords. You have to learn to negotiate with your landlord. Our first webinar next week is going to be with a lawyer, another lawyer, and we're going to be talking about how to negotiate with your landlord. It is for commercial tenancies specifically, but you have to start somewhere. The other thing is, from an advocacy perspective, I've suggested to Spencer Chandra Herbert that they look at finding law students who will help people negotiate with their landlords. Help needs to be brought to bear, because it's an unequal bargaining relationship and people are going to be fearful of the possible eviction. Evictions aren't going to be permitted, but just because the RTB isn't going to permit an eviction doesn't mean that a landlord isn't going to slap an eviction notice on your door. And the reality is most of us would feel that that is intimidating and bullying behavior. And it's wrong. They're still going to do it. So they're still going to make you feel crappy. And that's why you need to contact track. And if you're not in BC, contact your local legal aid clinic. In Ontario, you have a legal aid clinic that does nothing but housing. They have 93 legal aid clinics in Ontario that deal with this stuff, people. I know they're being cut by Doug Ford, but still, go to the legal clinics and seek out, and in BC, go to track, because that's what they're supposed to deal with.
And in BC, they did make a provision that rent increases cannot be asked at this point.
Sure,
so
sure. Yeah. They're not supposed to do it. Where's the enforcement going to come from?
Yeah.
I've never heard of the RTB taking a landlord to, well, the only landlords that ever end up in court are the ones where the city is basically saying you're operating a slum and we're going to take it over. The enforcement powers by the previous Liberal government were completely stripped out of the Residential Tenancy Act. So that's the other side. Take it up with government to put more teeth into this. It's one thing for the government to say, thou shalt not do it. It's quite another to say, it's actually a crime if you do it.
I have a question about, so an arts educator has asked, what if you've already invoiced for work that was supposed to happen in April, but now it's postponed indefinitely and you're not getting paid? Is that going back to the contract or?
Yeah, I mean, it really should go back to the contract. I hate to say this to some of you who are listening, who are running organizations. If you got a grant to have this person do something and you're not sure that you're going to be able to deliver that, and you know that the funders are going to be lenient with respect to demanding that you fulfill every single deliverable, then you may pay the artist or the educator in this instance and use that when you file your report. And that's what I understand funders are saying is, we will take this into account. So if you've had to pay an individual, then that's what you've had to do. You know, if it depends on the scope and and what it is. I think it's harder where companies, arts organizations are anticipating ticket sales to offset the production costs. I think it's a bit harder for them. But for educational organizations where really they're not losing anything by paying the artist, it's assuming the funder isn't going to penalize them and actually will say, you did your best. You know, I think expecting people whose incomes are already really low to wait indefinitely for that $50, it depends on how much, but even $500 would make a huge difference if that person, especially April. I think it'll be easier for folks as we get into more robust online systems for doing educational work. I think organizations need time to migrate in that area. I also think that the benefits that people are so anxious about, the CERB benefit and so on, will know more about where they actually are at by the end of April. And I know that isn't the most helpful for some of you, and it's the best that we can do under the circumstances. I would encourage the educator to ask if they would even consider a 50% of the fee as a sign of good faith.
Great. The next question is around, so if an organization has recently hired, or they were supposed to have a staff person start during the pandemic, but so they've started the job, but now are working remotely, and so that individual doesn't have access to office space or equipment. Should they continue to be hired as an employee, or should it be shifted to an independent contractor?
Well, that is one of those situations where it's going to depend a lot on what they're doing. Just because somebody's working from home doesn't mean that they're not employees within the meaning of the Employment Standards Act. I'm assuming that you have a contract in place with that individual that sets out the termination provisions, if there are any. In an ideal world, you would have a provision in your contract that also speaks to temporary layoffs. I think that moving forward, every single organization that has a contractor should have a temporary or an employee, some addressing not just of cancellation, but of actual temporary layoffs. You know, so yeah, I mean, I think if you were intending them to be an employee and they now work from home, you may have to incur some costs to figure out how that's going to work by providing them with the tools of the trade, as it were. But just because you're no longer providing them with an office doesn't mean that they're not an employee within the meaning of the Employment Standards Act. So I would be very leery about thinking you could deal with it that way. And I think that we need policies on working from home. We need to establish a schedule, daily check-ins. How are you going to do that? How are you going to monitor the work? Privacy is a big issue. You need to make sure that they have the right setups at home, that they're not keeping sensitive information at home, that they know if they do have it at home, how they're dealing with it. Locked filing cabinets, if it's on paper, encryption. Has the society got the capacity to have its employees working from home? And if you don't, then maybe you need to be looking at temporary layoffs as a way to give you the opportunity to figure out, what your provider is going to be so that you have the best cloud-based system to operate from. So there's a lot of different variables. I did see earlier today a Google Doc that's floating around on tools and tips for remote workers. And it lists like a variety of all of the various platforms that are available, and also the considerations and how to keep your team engaged. And I haven't had a chance to review it carefully, but I will put a link up on our website to it and maybe shoot it over to you, Kenji, because I think that a lot of this is happening very fast, and let's give ourselves an opportunity to do it right. But yeah.
Great. There's just a quick question for the URL again, and that's tenants.bc.ca.
Yeah,
for
I'm
folks
pretty
around
sure
tenants.
it's, if somebody, maybe Amanda can check and see it's tracked.
Yeah, I just double checked. So
Yeah.
tenants.bc.ca. So the next question is around, it's tied to some of the things that you mentioned around contracts and text form or verbal agreements. So if an offer has been made to an artist for next season, but no contracts have been signed, how binding could that be if we can't afford to do all the shows we had planned?
Yeah, well, in order for a contract to be legally binding, there needs to be an offer and acceptance. If you've made an offer and it hasn't been accepted, you can rescind the offer. If you made the offer and it was accepted, then you have to address yourselves to how you're going to get out of the contract. And that will depend on the situation. As you can imagine, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. If you know now that your season is going to go from 5 to 3 because of what's been going on, and say realistically, we're not going to be planning anything until September. I really hope that's not the case, and I'm being somewhat realistic, I think. That there's going to be some limitations to that, and you may have to, my suggestion would be to, if you've got offer and acceptance and there's nothing in the contract that speaks to what happens in the event of something going terribly wrong, I would make a good faith offer to the folks that you've decided not to proceed with and say, we'll get you back on another season, but this season we're going to have to, our shows are going to be cut in half, and we've had to make some tough decisions, and there are going to be costs associated with that, and that's one of those costs. You could, some companies may decide to simply say rescind the offer and hope that they don't get sued. I think there are going to be some, depending on what the nature of the contract is, though, I think there are going to be some circumstances, though, where doing that is going to result in conceivably a small claims court action. Because for some folks, that's going to be like, wait a minute, we have a contract, and you didn't give us notice, and there's lots of things that you can do to mitigate the damage of that or the potential of that. Yeah. And again, that would be is there a force majeure provision? But the thing is about looking too far in advance is right now we probably are in a force majeure situation. I don't think you can argue that there's going to be a force majeure in October, right? there's a pandemic today. We may all be lined up getting vaccines in October. I don't know. I'd
Yeah.
like to think so, but
Uh,
so
uh,
again, it's that, it's probably too long an answer for this forum, but
I think that a lot of this is also what is how does the community support each other during these really precarious times, right? So it's not a us versus them right now in terms of organizations who are paying or supposed to pay contracts and artists. We're trying to see how we can actually work together, and there are a lot of unknowns. So like
yeah,
Martha is kind of saying, is that it starts with a conversation, right? Like
yeah.
start with there, so it doesn't become a legal
And
issue.
I also think that this is the time for us to reach out to our peers and say, whether it's the GVPTA, whether it's CARFAC or Authors Association, the Writers Guild, the unions, whatever it is to say, hey man, can you help? We're part of this community and we're struggling, and can you help? And sometimes and we would also be helping them to gather the data on what the needs of their community are by saying, hey, we really need somebody to help us work this out, and maybe they could come up with best practices in this. Here's the best practice for the independent theater community of Vancouver, based on conversations with the stakeholders
Yeah.
in Vancouver that are saying, we want to support you. Here's how we think we can do it. And, and get PAC to say, yeah, and we agree. We're going to suspend the CTA, strictly speaking, to the extent that one could ever do that. And we're going to enable you to do this on a community-based, localized basis for the benefit of the entire sector as a whole.
Yeah, the conversations I'm having both nationally and provincially with other art service organizations is around what are the recommendations we would have for engagers, so presenters, producers, with their work with artists. And, there are a number of kind of good faith provisions being talked about, like paying 2 weeks of 2 weeks of a contract, or a percentage of a contract, because we know that everybody's in a precarious situation. Just in terms of like moving things forward, the next question, Martha, is around intellectual property rights. So a lot of the stuff that's happening right now, online workshops, performances, and readings, potentially change things around intellectual property rights, in the sense that people can keep slides you share, record online performances, workshops. What kind of language in contracts should be included or being adjusted from an artist and educator point of view?
Well, first and foremost, okay, this is where you get into, you can have the minimalist approach or you can have the maximalist approach. The minimalist approach is it's available in whatever grainy pile it's available on, how many pixels, and you can have at it and put a Creative Commons license on it if you wish, though I would just put it up there. I wouldn't even worry about going to a Creative Commons license, frankly. In any event, the reality is that for those of you who really are concerned about the need to be able to monetize and control your content, time limited. This material will be available for 1 week and 1 week only, and then it comes down. That way, it's not up in perpetuity. And in fact, I think it's good practice, because a lot of this information is going to be stale in another 6 to 10 weeks, possibly. Like even this webinar video thing we're doing. So, yes, I'm making it available, but only for a limited time. I would, in all circumstances, recommend that an artist indicate that all rights are reserved to them, and that it is a violation of their copyright to reproduce it without their permission. If for no other reason than if somebody did rip your stuff online, that it would have been made very clear by having a copyright symbol on your site and even on any materials, that all the materials are copyright Bob and Fred Inc. or Kenji Maeda design, you know. I think once we put stuff up on the interwebs, there is a limit to how much we can control it. That's just a fact of life, and and we have to live with that. I did notice, you know, for example, the National Theatre is putting up archived works, making them available for free, but any of the stuff that they need to monetize is not going to be made available for free. And I think we have to make those kinds of decisions ourselves. I think we're going to see the proliferation of platforms that are going to enable folks to generate some funds. I would be very careful and read the terms and conditions of all of those platforms, because I would not want to be inadvertently giving a platform the ability to republish or repost stuff. Because, yeah, it happens.
Okay. Next question is specifically around Fringe, using the model of the Fringe Festival circuit. So many touring Fringe artists have been selected through the lottery, going from June to September. They've paid a fee to secure their spot, and artists have incurred a number of expenses related to the preparation of those performances. So they're asking that in the event that festivals are canceled, either the festivals carry over the registration fee to the next year, or more generally, the festivals don't take action without consulting the artists affected. What would your recommendation be, both for artists in those situations? Should they be asking for refunds? Should they be like, what are the ramifications there, but also from the organization side?
Whoa. Yeah, that's it. I mean, I wonder if, if there's a possibility that there's still an audience to watch Fringe shows online. It seems to me that a lot of Fringe shows, at least the ones I've seen, are, probably most suitable to this kind of mode of production, in the sense that they don't need a lot of space or can be done relative. I mean, I don't want to overgeneralize. So there may be see this as an opportunity to still be able to do something. But if the Fringe Festival cancels the Fringe Festival, I would have thought that Fringe festivals do have cancellation provisions in there. Don't they? And I think, and Fringe festivals do get government money, so they do get funded. So they're going to I mean, maybe they postpone everything till next year. I don't know. That's a tough one, because I know there's a circuit right across the country. And there is a National Association of Fringe Festivals. Surely they're going to come up with a proposal on what to do about the Fringe festivals. And, I think the other side of where a lot of the Fringe performers, it's like, well, hopefully you haven't spent too much and you can reuse it next year, I mean, this is going to pass, and so it might not be the end of the world, but obviously there are some damages, certainly some costs associated with it. I'm just not sure. A lot would depend on the individual circumstance, but how much does it cost to register for a Fringe show anyway? It's not a lot. Like, I think the loss is significant on both sides. I think a lot of it, but it's the ability that each individual on both sides is going to have to carry the risk and carry the loss. I hate to say it like that, but that may not be all that helpful.
Okay.
And
The
if somebody says to you, look, I need the money back, I think maybe you give them the money back.
Somebody's just sent me a message saying it can be between 500 and 850 to register.
Wow. Well,
so
then, those are the kinds of costs that, from my point of view, when the funders say, keep track of your losses, that's the loss that they want to see. We had to refund all these people. It's sort of like the air, all the flights that got canceled,
The next question is back to force majeure. So if we haven't included force majeure in our contracts, is there a case law precedent which could be leveraged?
Well, then you're looking at your termination provision. Under what circumstances can you terminate the contract? Maybe a 2-week without notice, and maybe 2 weeks with notice. Does it require a breach? Arguably, because all the venues are closed, it's a breach of the contract. What happens in the event of a breach? Somebody pays usually something somewhere along the line. It's not, whether it's force majeure or not, it's a good faith gesture. It's, this was completely unanticipated. It's completely out of our control. We're not going to go ahead with the show that was supposed to go up in April. And here's what we propose. We're terminating the contract. Some people could take, some companies could take the position that they're off the hook. And then it would be up to the company, the producing company, let's say ZZ Theater and Transcripts, if they hadn't gotten that show up, even the one day, let's say that they were to be left holding the bag, which did not happen and probably would not happen from the fire hall, and they were out X amount of dollars, then they would have to decide whether or not they would say that by pulling the plug when it did, that it was a breach of contract. They would then file an action, and they'd still, there'd be, the first thing I would do is I would write a letter and say, dear Donna, this is what it cost, and we'd really appreciate whatever how can we come to a resolution of this? Because in canceling the contract in the absence of a force majeure, in the absence of, there's a very good reason for closing, and before the emergency was declared, I don't know. I think you negotiate something. And in the case of the one I'm using, which I'm only using because it's the last play that I saw, is that, everybody wants to do their best. And it really is, this is what the grant funding is for. And if anything, it's going to be hard on the workers for the presenters, because they become the first to go, because the hard costs of running the theater may not be entirely, then it's a tough call. It depends a lot on the financial situation.
I just got a message from somebody just as a follow-up. The Victoria Fringe emailed to provide revised cancellation policies, and on June 1st they will announce whether the festival goes ahead in potentially altered form or it's postponed. So I'm assuming that similar kinds of things will be coming through as organizations make decisions moving forward.
Yeah.
Martha, I'm going to move to the next question just because of time. So this one is, we are an arts organization that manages a city property with artists and arts group tenants. What are the options for tenants who no longer can pay rent? This would tank our organization as we relied on rent as opposed to fundraising.
That's where you hold the lease with the city?
I'm assuming that's what it seemed like in the
Right.
question.
So these are sort of a form of subtenancies, I guess.
Probably.
Yeah. Well,
Yes,
first
they
of
said
all,
yes.
yeah. So, you know, the city you should write to the city and get them to forgive the rent. Right? I mean, that's the first thing. Dear Mayor, dear Kennedy, you know, hello, we're fucked. So, you know, that's number one. You know, I think there's going to be a number of issues that are, I mean, this is where you get into you're a landlord now. So talk to landlords of BC about how they recommend dealing with how to handle this situation. Are these individuals who could apply, who applies for the rent subsidy, the $500? I think it's I think the money goes to the landlord. So if they're a tenant within the meaning of the residential tenancy branch, I would get them, they must apply for that $500. So you know that at least is going to be there. As for the remainder of the rent, you know, you're probably affected by the RTA like everybody else, and you should not be moving to evict. The reality is that this is going to take a big chunk of this was probably, I have a feeling I know who this is. And I think this may be one of those circumstances. I'm sorry to say you need some legal advice. At the same time, it's going to, I would be saying to the city, you know, you're going to have to bail us out for 6 months until this situation regularizes. And I would actually say to the artists that are living there, that if they are working at all, that they, you know, shouldn't be unreasonable when they're dealing with landlords that are like the one we're talking about, where they really are putting the organization at risk. And this is also one of those situations, now that I'm thinking about it, where the question of the availability of the other supports to business becomes really important. And I'm thinking whether or not there's a need to engage with the independent business folk to say there is a category of business known as a social enterprise that may not be a for-profit company and so may not be able to avail themselves of some of these benefits, but needs some assistance in these circumstances. And is there a way for us to address that?
So
I wish I had an easy, pithy answer for that,
yeah,
but I don't.
there's a question around can businesses and not-for-profits apply for the rent subsidy? And my understanding is no. Those are for individuals in their own home living space.
Yeah. I mean, you know, if you're lucky enough to be operating out of a city building, hallelujah, because I think you need to, I can't imagine the city's going to be unreasonable given the situation. Though some of them might be reluctant depending on which area you're in the city or what building you're in. And that is a problem, but absolutely seek rent abatement from your landlord. For those of you in commercial situations, there is a reason why you pay first and last month's rent. Now might be a good time to be seeing if you can apply the last month's rent to this month. Even if you can only make a half of the rent, but something is better than nothing. Commercially, I think the commercial real estate folks don't want the market to implode. And so hopefully you can negotiate, but that is also why the first webinar we're doing next week is around negotiating with your landlord around commercial tenancy situations, because I think a lot of you who've probably signed leases with people with that you never read. And yeah, they're really, really hard to get out of.
So we're at 11:52 Pacific. I just want to go over a few wrap up things before we end. So you mentioned the webinar that you're doing next week. Is it going to be posted on the Plio website? Is that right?
We'll have it on the Plio website, the Artist Legal Outreach website, and the Law for Nonprofits websites. We'll put
Great.
it out on social media.
Yeah, so we're gonna also, for those of you who are asking about these next legal webinars, we're going, once those webinars are fully confirmed and like all the information is available, we'll send out a message to everybody who's attended this webinar to guide you to that website and those webinars. But you can also look at pacificlegaloutreach.com as the primary place to find that information for you, and it will be open, I'm assuming, to any organization, any artist from across the country as well.
Yeah, and I should point out that on our website is also the National Network of Legal Clinics for the Arts project survey that we sent out last month. I have kept it open so that people who weren't aware of it now have an opportunity to fill it in and include in areas where possible, where there's comments and so on, any issues that you're experiencing and think you need from in relation to COVID-19. One of the surprises to some of you may be also to know that the Artist Legal Outreach in our 15 years has never received any funding from the BC Arts Council. We continue to be ineligible for BC Arts Council funding, and that the ministry appears to be of the view that because the arts and culture sector has not asked for it or included it in its advocacy for improved services, that they must not need it. So now is the time, in my view, to be saying to the powers that be that we need this sort of information on a regular basis. We need a place we can go to get advice. If we need it, we need law students who can answer our questions through law, as we do for nonprofits through law students at lawfornonprofits.ca. That this is a service that we value now more than ever. We need you to make that, tell them you need it. So for any of you that had questions, say, oh, by the way, I did this webinar and I learned a lot, hopefully, and that we'd like more of them, and we hope you'll support Plio's efforts to get more information out quicker right now. Thank you.
And just a few things on my end. So if you are an independent or individual artist, arts workers, I would recommend looking at I Lost My Gig Facebook group, because they are posting a lot of similar kinds of questions, especially when it comes to eligibility and navigating some of the government programs. Especially what's useful is that people are reporting back saying, I just talked to CRA and this was my experience. So it's not like advice, but it is kind of seeing what is the actual experience of how long were they waiting on the phone, what questions were being answered by that one representative, so that you can kind of learn what other people are experiencing. Know that all the questions that we haven't been able to answer just because of the time, those are all going to be provided to Martha as well, so that, again, we're going to continue to build out the questions as we move forward, and it's going to be incorporated into future webinars that Martha and her team can answer. for all of you in BC, I would highly recommend, if you haven't yet, please do fill out the impact survey that is on the GVPTA website. That is really helping us to track the economic and just personal impact that COVID has had on our sector. It's for all organizations and all artists across BC. There are a number of other surveys I know from all across Canada. So if you're in Ontario, there are Ontario-specific ones, but there are also national surveys to fill out. I know it can be a slog to go through some of these surveys, but it's really important because we're having direct conversations with federal and provincial funders and municipal funders around what is the strategy moving into recovery. The other thing that we have on the GVPTA website. So next week we do have, or we have a webinar tomorrow with Jackie Yenga, specifically around cultivating community connections and building resiliency. And then for organizations, we have a webinar next week with Charmaine Hammond, talking about how do organizations continue to be resilient moving through these times. And one of the things that she talked about with me before was that she had some experience with the Fort McMurray fires, the wildfires, and what it looked like coming out of it. And so there are definitely a lot of learnings that we can take from that. And we're going to continue to announce more webinars on our end, and we'll share Martha's webinars as well. And the last thing is that if any of your organizations in BC or artists are needing to use Zoom as a platform to host your meetings, we as GVPTA are offering use of one of our Zoom accounts. So there's just a simple form and a availability calendar that you can put in a request, and then we give you access to one of our Zoom accounts for a specific time frame for meetings and things like that. Anyway, all the information is there. So Martha, thank you again for being part of this, and well, obviously we're going to be in touch. And thank you everyone for asking all the different kinds of questions. We're still, you know, navigating through this ourselves, and we're here to provide as much support as we can across all the art service organizations and all the agencies as well, because we're trying to work together to kind of move things forward. Any last thoughts, Martha, before you leave?
Well, stay calm, carry on. I'm not going anywhere.
Great.
We'll be back, and we're really trying to do what we can to help support everyone. So just keep the sign up to the website, keep on keeping on, and the sun's come out. Let's get in the garden. I don't know.
These are all really great ideas. Yeah, thank you. And if anybody else has questions that I can answer, then feel free to email me as well, and I'll be able to answer those as well. Thanks everybody. Thanks Martha. We'll talk to you all soon.
Bye.